It's mission day 47. An astronaut is 250 miles above Earth. They haven't slept properly in 4 days. They've already completed 2 unscheduled EVAs this week that weren't in their original mission plan. Their hands are shaking slightly from fatigue. Mission control comes through on comms. We know it's been a heavy week, but we have a thermal regulation issue on the secondary module. Any chance you can get to it before end of shift? The astronaut keys the mic and says, "Copy that. I'll get it done." Why did they do that? Here's what's striking about that scenario. This person was selected from thousands of applicants. They passed the most rigorous psychological screening process on Earth. They trained for years to perform under exactly this kind of pressure. They know, better than almost any human alive, what their operational limits are. And they still couldn't say no. Not because they didn't know the word, not because they lacked the courage, but because something deep inside them, something that has nothing to do with astronaut training and everything to do with being human, made the yes come out automatically, before the rational brain even got a vote. That something is what this video is about. And here's why it matters to you, right now, wherever you're watching from. The same mechanism that fired in that cockpit fires in you every time your boss, your partner, your friend, your colleague asks for something you don't have capacity to give. The altitude is different. The psychology is identical. Today, we go deep on why saying no is so hard, what's actually happening in your nervous system when the word gets stuck, and what you can do about it. Stay with me. Before we go anywhere, I want to give you some data, because I want you to understand, from the very start, that this is not a personal flaw you have. This is a species-wide pattern, and it shows up even in environments where the stakes of saying yes to the wrong thing are literally life and death. A 2022 study by the American Psychological Association found that 49% of Americans describe themselves as chronic people pleasers, consistently saying yes to requests they want to decline. NASA's own psychological research on long-duration mission crews found that overcommitment, taking on tasks beyond individual capacity to avoid interpersonal friction, is one of the top 3 contributors to crew performance degradation after month 2 of a mission. A Harvard study found that people systematically overestimate how disappointed or angry someone will be if they say no, typically by a factor of 3. You are pre-suffering a reaction that is 3 times worse than the one that will actually happen. That last one is worth sitting with. Astronauts in a closed metal tube, 250 miles from Earth, with no way out and everything on the line, are still overriding their own limits to avoid a social discomfort that is almost certainly smaller than they think it will be. Here's the first thing I need to dismantle. The story most people tell themselves is, "I say yes too much because I'm a good team player," or "I don't want to let people down." And maybe those things are partially true, but they are not what's actually driving the pattern. The inability to say no is not a discipline problem. It is not a communication skill you didn't learn. It is a nervous system response. It is happening below the level of your conscious decision-making, in a part of your brain that is not interested in mission parameters or personal boundaries. It is interested in one thing: keeping you safe from social threat. And once you understand what's actually firing in your head when you feel that yes being pulled out of you against your will, you can start to work with the system instead of being overridden by it. Even at 250 miles up. Especially at 250 miles up. Here's our flight plan. First, we go to the evolutionary route, why human brains were literally wired to treat rejection as a survival threat. Then, we examine the 3 specific mechanisms driving the pattern. Then, the origin story, how your early environment may have locked in a response you're still running decades later. Then, we look at what chronic yes-saying actually costs, including what it costs astronauts on real missions. And finally, the part that actually changes things, how to rewire the response. Not motivation, neuroscience. To understand why saying no is so hard, even for astronauts, we have to go back roughly 100,000 years, because the brain that gets launched into orbit in a Soyuz capsule is running software that was written for a very different environment. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, you lived in a small tribe of 50 to 150 people, and in that environment, social rejection was not uncomfortable. It was potentially fatal. Being cast out of the group meant no fawn. So your brain evolved a catastrophically sensitive early warning system for social threat. The same neural circuits that process physical pain, the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula, are activated by social rejection. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. A landmark 2003 UCLA study used fMRI brain scans to demonstrate that social rejection activates the same neural regions as physical pain. Your brain processes, "They're disappointed in me," the same way it processes, "Something is physically hurting me." Now put that brain inside a space station. 6 people. No privacy. No exit. Every interpersonal interaction amplified by confinement, by fatigue, by the absence of every normal social escape valve. A small conflict that on Earth you could walk away from. Here, you cannot walk away from. You sleep 10 feet from this person. You eat with them. You depend on them for your survival. In that environment, your nervous system's social threat alarm is not overreacting. It is responding rationally to a genuinely high-stakes social situation. The problem is that your nervous system cannot tell the difference between the ISS and your Tuesday afternoon in an open-plan office. It runs the same threat response in both environments. It treats your manager's mild annoyance the same way it treats abandonment 250 miles above Earth. You are not too nice. You are too evolutionary. That is a very different problem, and it has a very different solution. OD, no shelter, no protection. Alone, you died. NASA calls it crew cohesion. Psychologists call it the fawn response. The mechanism is the same. The fawn response, a term introduced by trauma therapist Pete Walker, is the impulse to immediately appease, accommodate, or comply when you sense potential conflict or disapproval. It's what happens when your nervous system detects social threat and responds with automatic compliance before your conscious brain has even processed the situation. In a crew context, this looks like the astronaut who always volunteers for the extra task, who never flags that they're at capacity, who smiles through exhaustion because conflict feels more dangerous than collapse. Their nervous system has calculated, correctly in evolutionary terms, that maintaining harmony is the safest strategy. Research by Bessel, van der Kolk, and colleagues found that chronic fawning behavior is strongly correlated with early experiences of conditional approval, environments where belonging felt dependent on compliance. The fawn response was an intelligent adaptation. In the right environment, it is a genuine social skill. The question, for the astronaut and for you, is whether your current environment actually requires it, or whether you're running a high-cost strategy for a threat that no longer exists at the level your system believes it does. The second mechanism is one of the most psychologically fascinating, and one of the most operationally destructive. It's called anticipatory guilt. And here's how it works inside the spacecraft. Before the astronaut even keys the mic to say no, their brain runs a simulation. Not of what will probably happen, but of what the worst plausible outcome is. Mission control's disappointment, the commander's frustration, the crew's perception of them as the weak link, a relationship cooling, a performance review. All of this fires before a single word has been spoken, and they feel guilty about this imagined reaction before it has happened, and often for a reaction that will never materialize at anything close to the predicted intensity. They are pre-punishing themselves for an emotional catastrophe they have invented. The Harvard study I mentioned earlier showed that people predicted their no would cause twice as much distress in the recipient as it actually did, across hundreds of controlled trials. The emotional impact of declining was consistently and significantly overestimated. In other words, The astronaut's guilt is running a simulation that is calibrated to catastrophe. And they are making real operational decisions about their own safety and performance limits, based on that faulty simulation. The third failure mode is the one that's hardest to surface in a debrief. And I want to be careful here, because I think it matters. For a significant number of chronic yes-sayers, whether they're floating on a space station or sitting in a Tuesday meeting, there is an underlying belief operating completely outside conscious awareness. It goes something like this: my value to this crew, this team, this relationship is conditional on my usefulness. If I stop being useful, if I say no, if I set a limit, if I take up space, I risk becoming expendable. This belief is almost never stated. In astronaut culture, it is actively suppressed, because the selection process filters hard for people who project competence and reliability. But it functions as a background operating assumption that shapes every micro-decision. Saying no doesn't just feel like a communication choice, it feels like a threat to belonging. To your place on the crew. To the version of yourself that deserves to be here. Research by Kristen Neff at the University of Texas shows that individuals with externally contingent self-worth, those whose sense of value depends on performance and approval, are significantly more likely to overcommit and systematically suppress their own limits, regardless of the operational consequences. Your yes is not always generosity. Sometimes it is anxiety wearing a mission patch, and learning to tell the difference, for the astronaut and for you, is some of the most important psychological work a person can do. Now I want to go one layer further back. Because the astronaut who can't say no at mission day 47 didn't develop that pattern on the ISS. They brought it with them. It was already installed before they ever sat in a launch vehicle. Think about the child who grows up in a household where one person's emotional state controls the atmosphere of the entire home, where reading the room, detecting early signals of displeasure, adjusting behavior accordingly, making sure the temperature stays safe, becomes the primary survival skill. That child becomes extraordinarily good at two things: sensing the emotional state of others and managing their own behavior to prevent bad outcomes. Now that child grows up. They leave the house. They may go through university, through a career, through astronaut selection. But the operating system travels with them. The hypervigilance travels. The automatic calculation. Is this person okay with me? Am I about to lose something? What do I need to do to maintain safety? That calculation never got updated. A 2021 meta-analysis found that adults raised in environments with conditional approval, where positive regard was implicitly tied to compliance and performance, were more than twice as likely to exhibit chronic people-pleasing patterns as adults, regardless of their subsequent achievements or status. I want to say this carefully. This is not about blame. Most of the homes that created these patterns were not malicious. They were human, full of their own unresolved wounds, their own unexamined patterns, their own best attempts. But the effect was real. And here is what matters for the astronaut. And for you. You're still running rules that were written for a mission that ended years ago. The launch environment you're flying from no longer exists. But the launch sequence is still triggering every time Mission Control asks you a question. I want to talk about cost, because most people, and most astronauts frankly, treat chronic overcommitment as a manageable inconvenience, a sign of dedication even. You're pulling the extra EVA. You're the reliable one. How bad can that be? Here is what the operational data actually shows. NASA's psychological research on long-duration ISS missions found that crew members who consistently overcommitted, who said yes beyond their recovery threshold, showed measurable cognitive degradation beginning around week 8. Not from the work itself. From the accumulated load of carrying commitments they didn't choose. There is a documented phenomenon in long-duration spaceflight called third-quarter syndrome. Somewhere around the halfway point, performance drops, irritability spikes, and interpersonal friction increases sharply, not because the mission has gotten harder, but because the emotional debt accumulated from months of suppressed limits has reached a breaking point. Research from the University of California found that people who habitually override their own preferences to accommodate others show significantly elevated cortisol, the primary stress hormone, even in the absence of acute stressors. The body is running a stress response to a threat that isn't currently in the room. It is responding to the accumulated weight of all the Noahs that never got said. But here is the cost I think cuts deepest. Every time the astronaut says, "Copy that," when they mean, "I don't have capacity for this," they send themselves a message. The message is, "My limits are negotiable. My signals are not trustworthy. My needs are acceptable collateral damage." Do that enough times, and something erodes. Not performance. Not immediately. Something quieter. The astronaut stops trusting their own internal read of their situation. They lose the ability to accurately assess their own state because they have spent months overriding it. And in space, in an environment where accurate self-assessment is not a soft skill but a survival competency, that is a serious systems failure. The most dedicated astronauts I have read about are not the ones who never said no. They are the ones who knew precisely when to say it, and had the psychological architecture to follow through. Okay, the other side. What is actually happening neurologically when someone successfully says no? And what does the mission data show about crews that can do it? Brain imaging studies show that the moment of saying no, the actual delivery of the boundary, activates the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with conscious choice, long-term mission planning, and value-based decision-making. It is, literally, an act of higher-order cognition. And here is the finding that surprises people. Saying no that is congruent with your actual capacity also activates the brain's reward circuitry. Not immediately. There is typically a spike of anxiety first. But after the no is said, in people who have practiced it, there is a measurable neural reward signal. Operating with integrity feels good. Not comfortable, initially. Good. A 2020 study in Frontiers in Psychology found that individuals who regularly practiced value-aligned refusals reported higher self-respect, lower anxiety, and stronger interpersonal relationships than those who habitually complied, even though the compliant group was perceived as more likable by outside observers. Stronger relationships, not weaker ones. Because a yes you mean is worth 10 yeses you don't. And nowhere is that more true than in a 6-person crew with no escape route. Here is one more finding that changes the operational picture. When a crew member says no clearly and calmly, without excessive apology, without over-explanation, without the uncomfortable hedging that signals internal conflict, the receiving person experiences far less negative reaction than predicted. What creates the most interpersonal friction in confined environments is not the number. It is the vague, apologetic half-yes that turns into resentment 3 weeks later. That is what damages crew cohesion. Research from Stanford's Social Dynamics Lab found that clear, warm refusals were rated as significantly more respectful by recipients than vague, apologetic, partial agreements, even when the practical outcome was identical. Clarity reads as respect. Ambiguity reads as discomfort and dismissal. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with it. There is a transmission that never gets sent from the ISS. Not a technical report, not a mission update. The transmission that goes, I don't have capacity for this, not because I'm weak, but because I'm already past my limit, and I need you to hear that. That transmission, that honest, clear signal, is the one that the astronaut's nervous system will do almost anything to suppress. Because somewhere in their history, in the environment that wrote their operating system, that signal felt like a declaration of inadequacy. Like proof that they didn't belong on the crew. Like the thing that would make people question whether they deserved to be there at all. And I think most of you watching this know that transmission. Not from a space station. From your own life. From the meeting you sat through past your limit. the favor you agreed to at midnight, the project you took on when you were already drowning, the, of course, no problem, that cost you 3 days of your own life. Because underneath all the psychology we've covered today, the evolutionary wiring, the fawn response, the anticipatory guilt, the pre-launch programming, underneath all of it, there is a simpler and older fear. The fear that who you are, without the yes, might not be enough. That without the usefulness, the compliance, the perpetual availability, there might not be enough reason for the crew to keep you. And I want to say this as clearly as I can. That fear is a lie. It was a reasonable conclusion to draw from certain kinds of early experiences. But it is a lie. The people who genuinely value you are not there because of what you do for them. They are there because of who you are. And who you are becomes more visible, not less, when you stop hiding it behind an endless series of transmissions that say, "Copy that." When the truth is, I need a different answer here. So here's the reframe I want you to take with you. Saying no is not an abandonment of the crew. It is an honest status report. It tells the people around you what you actually have capacity for, what is genuinely true for your current operational state. And honest status reports, real ones, not performance, are the foundation of every crew worth being part of. The astronauts with the strongest mission records are not the ones who never said no. They are the ones whose yes was worth something. Because when they said, "I'll handle it," every person on that crew knew it was true. Their commitment meant something precisely because it wasn't automatic. It was chosen. So here is your mission for this week. Not a strategy, not a script. One transmission. I want you to say no once to something small, low stakes, and say it without an apology, without an explanation, without a qualifier. Just, "I don't have capacity for that right now," or "That's not going to work for me." And then stop talking. Because the silence after the no is where most people abort. They fill it. They backtrack. They find a sudden qualification they didn't know they had. Hold the silence. Let the transmission stand. See what comes back. Because I promise you, the response from mission control is almost never what your nervous system is predicting. All right, mission debrief. 5 things we covered today. 1. The difficulty of saying no is not a weakness, and it is not a training deficiency. It is a neurological response. Your brain treats social rejection as a physical threat, because for most of human history, that's exactly what it was. Even astronauts can't override it with willpower. 2. 3 specific mechanisms are driving the pattern: the fawn response, anticipatory guilt, and conditional self-worth. Each one is real, each one has a logic, and each one can be worked with once you can see it running. 3. For most people, this pattern was installed before they ever left their launch environment. Understanding that is not about blame. It's about knowing which rules you're still following that no longer apply to your current mission. 4. The operational cost of chronic yes-saying is not inconvenience. It is cognitive degradation, elevated stress hormones, eroded self-trust, and eventually, if it runs long enough, a complete loss of accurate self-assessment. The body keeps the mission log, whether you're writing in it or not. 5. Saying no clearly and calmly does not damage crew relationships. The data consistently shows it strengthens them. A yes you mean is worth more than 10 yeses you don't. And a clear transmission is more respectful than a vague, apologetic signal that leaves everyone uncertain. Okay, I want to hear from you. 2 things. First, go to the comments and send me that transmission. What is the last thing you said? Copy that, too. In your work, your relationships, your life. When everything in you wanted to say something different. 1 sentence. No explanation required. Second, are you taking the mission this week? 1. No. No apology. No qualifier. Tell me in the comments that you're doing it, and come back and tell me what came back from mission control. I genuinely want to know what happened. If this video gave you something real, hit like. It's a small thing on your end, but it helps this content reach the people who need it. And if you're new here, this is what we do on this channel. We take the science of being human seriously. No surface-level tips, no toxic positivity. Actual psychology, actual data, actual honesty about what's hard and why. Subscribe so you don't miss the next launch. I'm working on a follow-up video specifically on how to say no without guilt. The exact neuroscience-backed language patterns that make it easier over time. If you want that video, leave a comment that says "Mission Brief," and I'll know the demand is there. One last thing. If you watched this whole video and you recognized yourself in the astronaut who keys the mic and says, "Copy that," I want you to know that recognition is not nothing. That's the beginning of a different transmission. You can't change a pattern you can't see. Today, you saw it. Fly safe. I'll see you on the next mission.